Hi, I'm Anjali Alappat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 3, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. This week, I chat with Manjula Padmanabhan, playwright, journalist, comic strip artist, and author. Manjula is an Indian sci-fi legend, and I'm thrilled that we got to discuss her book, Stolen Hours, a collection of short stories. Featuring fiction written between 1984 and today, Manjula's work traverses time and space, combining humor, science, and philosophy in irresistible ways. Join us as we discuss how she got started as a writer, unconventional upbringings, telling stories with a dark edge, bureaucracy, religion, vampires, and finding the humor in myths. Hi, Manjula. Thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here. I'm excited to see what you're going to ask me. And I hope I say things that are interesting to you and to your listeners.
Oh, I'm sure you will. And I personally am thrilled to have you on. I've been a fan for a long time, and I'm kind of excited to talk about this book in particular, which is Stolen Hours.
Thanks.
Before we kind of get into your work, I wanted to ask you a bit about your journey as a writer. How did you get started? Did you always want to be one?
I can only back my way into this by saying that at the age when children are sort of thinking about the rest of their lives, I would say that's, in your early preteens. At that time, when I think about it, I realize how weird it must sound. I was extraordinarily self-confident. I had absolutely no doubt that I was going to live an interesting life. I was going to do interesting things. And I had an absolute expectation that I would be an author and an artist. It's not that I wanted to write. I expected that being an author and an artist is what I would do. It's not that I really paused to think about whether I liked it or not. It was an expression of who I was. And I would say that possibly at that age, I expected to be an artist. But writing was something I assumed you just did in your spare time. But as I grew older, it kind of reversed. Drawing and art was what I planned to do as work, whereas I wanted to be able to reserve writing for my more sort of serious output. And I only realized in my early 20s that it's not easy to be published. I'm smiling because I think young people don't realize that it's not the author's decision to be published. It is a publisher's. And authors cannot just go to a publishing house and say, hello, I'm here, and I'm sure you want to publish me. It doesn't happen like that. And any author listening to this will laugh bitterly because we all know that it's the primal struggle is to find a publisher. You might have the best ideas and wonderful books and novels and poems, but that doesn't mean anyone else is going to agree with you and publish them. Now, in my case, the process began with working for a small magazine called Parsiana. I was still doing my BA when I was introduced to this magazine, and in particular to a very charismatic editor called Jahangir Patel, who is still the editor of this small but lively magazine aimed specifically at the Parsi community. I'm not Parsi, but I was taken on as a member of the staff at the time that there were only 3 people. You had to learn at once how to write, how to be a journalist, how to think of your audience. I think what I learned from that magazine was how to be a writer who is not just focused on how wonderful the writer is, but really focusing on making sense to a reader, to shift the focus from the way we are when we come out of school and college. We learn how to write essays, and we are taught, how to be expressive, and taught actually to feel tremendous pride in our ability to write. Well, the first thing that happened at that magazine was that pride, that arrogance was broken down, so that you become humble and you recognize how much work it takes to put together just the opening paragraph of a well written article. Going through this process and understanding how very difficult it is to get published, and becoming modest and, I hope, humble enough to learn all over again how to express oneself, most importantly, to have something to say, to have something that is worthwhile to say. That is not something you learn overnight.
There's so much of what you've said that kind of struck a chord with me because I had a similar introduction to journalism. And I was, I think, even more arrogant because I came out of journalism school and thought I knew everything. And, I hopped straight into a setup quite like what you described, where I was one of, like, I think 4 girls in a newsroom. And we were so fried. Like, we were always working. It's some of the best times of my life in hindsight, but
Yeah, but at the time, it's frightening.
I also wanted to ask if there were any particular books or movies or TV shows that kind of influenced you as a storyteller, because you did mention you knew you were going to be a writer and artist quite early on with a lot of confidence. So, was there anything that led up to that?
I was a very avid reader as a child. I am often asked about influences and so on. Specific to fantasy, and I don't write fantasy, I would say I write science fiction. But I would say the influences that led towards writing a certain kind of a surreal story. In a sense, science fiction is reality, but stepped up or shifted a little to one side or beyond the frame that we live in. And I would say that my taste for surreal, slightly otherworldly fiction was certainly set by Alice in Wonderland, and in particular, the somewhat less well known Alice book, which is called Alice Through the Looking Glass. Many people, many young people today are introduced to the Alice books through Walt Disney's Alice in Wonderland animation film. And of course, there have been so many other films since then, especially the Disney version. It mixes many of the images from both books. Now, the both books are wonderful to read. They are aimed at children. But the second book, that is Alice Through the Looking Glass, is more cerebral, it's more sophisticated, and the level of complex imagery, the way that the world of dreams is shifted and made, somehow it makes you think. If you stay close to that story, you learn to appreciate the way the mind throws up images and dreams. And it also opens the door, the portal into a way of thinking which uses reality, but with certain, as if reality has a few knobs on it. And if you twiddle the knobs, you can get different feelings, you can get different experiences. It's very psychedelic. I would say that Alice set my taste in a particular direction. But even before that, though, there was a wonderful comic strip that used to appear in the Hindustan Times. I mean, we were exposed to it when we were in Delhi. And that strip was called Garth, Garth. It was a fabulous comic strip in which a man, a human, I mean, a mortal man called Garth, had the most extraordinary and fabulous adventures. What was interesting about him was that he was a hero, but human. He was not a superhero. Again, at 11, 12, 13, I was, was very much in the right frame of mind for Superman, Batman, and the whole range of American superheroes. But that was actually built onto the base that had already been established by Garth. And what many people do not realize is that the same person who wrote Garth also wrote the comic strip called Modesty Blaze. Now, Modesty Blaze is not science fiction, and at the same time, she was, incredibly ahead of her times heroine in the sense that she was tough, she was very attractive. Oh, I mean, do we even have to say incredibly intelligent? But that's not the point. The point was she was resilient without any fuss. She was a no fuss heroine of the kind who didn't have any interest in feminine pursuits of the conventional sort. She was completely disinterested in conventional life. And she went from adventure to adventure and had, an extraordinary time. And she was very capable. I mean, she took a lot of abuse in the form of fighting abuse, but she was never humiliated. She was never forced into the kind of compromising situations that many otherwise apparently self confident women in fiction or even non-fiction today. We see women being humiliated in various ways. You never saw her either let herself down or being humiliated by the forces of the story around her. She was an immensely strong character. And it is a sign of our times that a character like her could probably not exist in today's world because the polarization of gender roles has become such that if you are in any way female, then you have to conform to certain tropes. You have to look and behave a certain way, even if you're, a terrorist or a tomb raider or whatever. It's just typical that you'd have someone like Lara Croft, and she looks like a bimbo. But of course, you see that she kicks ass and she does all kinds of things. But at her heart, you can see that she's just another female prototype, male fantasy female prototype.
No, I think that's very interesting because I think what you're describing is something that I've thought about a lot, which is women written by men and also women written maybe by other women, but with the perspective of the male gaze. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, we have all been raised in the patriarchy. So there is obviously going to be some internalized misogyny, I suppose. And like the way we perceive characters, even if we're trying to make them groundbreaking, is like on a foundation of things that have come before us. It's very rare for us to be able to move out of what we've experienced, at least on some level. And those get interwoven into stories. It does sound wonderful to have something like that to look at while growing up, because for so many of us, finding independent, strong female characters was a hardship. It wasn't easy. And when you look back at them, you realize that how many of them were more conformist than you realized.
Well, I would raise my hand and say that I did have a somewhat non-conventional, unconventional upbringing in the sense that I didn't grow up, because I didn't grow up in India, I was not exposed to the social norms. And also, I belonged to a matrilineal society, a community. Of course, I can't know for sure whether it actually had any effect. At least I believe. I really was unaware that there was some kind of downbeat on the fact of being female. I was completely unaware of that till late into my teens. I remember meeting some in my school in Bangkok, meeting one of my fellow students, a girl who said she wished she was a boy. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, that is so weird. And it took years for me to understand that, people are, in fact, a lot of people, millions, are raised to think that men are better than women. I never got that. And my approach, for whatever reason, was just to shrug and move away. These difficulties are nothing compared to people who cannot walk away. Whereas I was unable to walk away from parental oversight and from the group, the community or family or whatever pressure. I was able to be away from it. That statement didn't affect me, didn't enter my psyche in the way that I've seen with so many of my friends, that they are oppressed not really by abusive others, but they are oppressed by the loving relations they have with their family. Their family loves them and wants them to conform. I didn't get that.
I think that's a very interesting point, because you've raised something that I think a lot of people underestimate, which is there's this kind of idealized idea that if someone loves you, they will accept you wholeheartedly. And I say that's idealized because I don't think that's true. I think a lot of love shows its way in kind of saying, why do you want to be different? Why can't you conform? You're going to have an unhappy life if you don't.
Right. Some people are able to tear themselves free, but the force of love can be hugely negative. We don't discuss that much. It's like it's just assumed to be like, honey is sweet and love is wonderful. Well, no, not always.
Not always. And I mean, on that note, I'd like to kind of transition into talking about your work. You have a very large body of work, and I had to pick one because otherwise we'd be here for several hours.
Right, days.
I really wanted to delve into Stolen Hours, which is a collection of short stories that you've written over the years. And it was published in 2023. I really enjoyed the collection, but I was mind blown by the idea that you'd written one of the stories, and it's one of the stories I noted quite strongly, that it was written in 1984 because it felt so relevant to 2024, and which I think is, I mean, it's down to your writing and down to your vision for it. But at the same time, I was kind of like, I was mind blown by 1984.
Every so often I'll meet someone who says, but you produce so much work. And I say, well, it's because I'm old. I'm 70 years old. And it's a long time. If you live long enough, you'll produce a lot of work.
But I think it's a credit to you that you could have written it a couple of months ago and I would have been like, oh, it's still very relevant, which is wonderful.
Yeah, that's nice to hear that. It's because I remain that same person, because my personal life hasn't changed much, in the sense that I continue to be a working person. I continue to not really be a family person. Most people are surprised to hear that I am actually married, but I hide that. I don't have children. And it's not just that I don't, by chance don't have them. I've never wanted to go down that path. I've had no interest in a family life. So, in a sense, I'm sure men or women, if you engage with family life, your perspective will change a great deal over the whole course of a long life. Those of us who are not married, who are not family oriented, it's not going to change much, because my path has been set from the time I was 19, 18, 19. I knew what I wanted to be. As I said, I knew from much earlier, but I have been enabled by circumstance and by being very stubborn to just do that. And I will give myself a little bit of credit. It's not just being stubborn. It's also, I'm not terribly concerned about being admired by people. If people don't like me or don't admire me or praise what I do, and in fact they don't, I don't actually care much. I don't live for the appreciation of others, whether it's my family or my peers. So I live in a kind of sealed unit. I produce work, it goes out, and I pay very little attention to how it is received. I'm grateful that I have a publisher. That's all I can say. I'm very grateful.
And it is wonderful because I do think a lot of people, and particularly I think creative people, I mean, mostly are raised on external validation, and writing and like creating is a very personal thing you're putting out. So other people's reactions do tend to bruise. So it is wonderful that you're able to give yourself space from that.
Yeah, my mother did not appreciate that. I have often quoted her saying, I wish you would write stories that my friends could read. Meaning her friends.
I think that might be the universal mother statement.
Yeah. Please write something that doesn't embarrass us. But in the end, I won't say approved, but I think she was proud of me. If I have regrets, I'm sorry that I was a disappointment to my parents in so many ways. But at least I think they felt a little bit of pride.
I think I read somewhere that children are always going to kind of be disappointments because whatever you do when you're having them, you're convinced they're going to turn out into some version of you. And the truth is, they probably aren't. So.
But in my case, because I have two older sisters who are paragons of virtue, I mean, they're wonderful, they're beautiful, they're extremely intelligent and very successful. They maxed their score. So, in a sense, they left the space for me to be wayward. It is very much the birth order situation that the third one is unpredictable.
Could you tell me a bit about where you get your inspiration for your short stories? Because a lot of them feel very specific. They're quite fantastical, but at the same time, there is a kernel of something that you recognize in each one of them.
So many of them were written because of a prompt. I mean, and the prompt might come in the form of a request for a short story for a particular issue or something like that. For instance, the story called Feast, it's in this collection, in which a European vampire visits India as a tourist and ends up staying. Feast was inspired by the theme for a collection of short stories that Tehelka magazine, I think Jay Arjun Singh was the editor. I met him recently and he reminded me of that. The theme we were given was just the one word, excess. And it's like a flashbulb immediately went to vampires. Because a vampire is a glutton, a person who, a thing, a being who can't stop and who suffers from a kind of hunger for infinite feeding. So, no, it seemed to be obvious. I assumed that everybody would be writing about vampires one way or the other.
I do love that story. And something else I've noticed is that while you're discussing very expansive places and spaces, and sometimes it's, a new planet or a completely dystopian time, you tend to be quite character driven, despite these very large scale worlds. And is that a deliberate choice? Do you tend to focus on the character?
It's just my style. I don't think it's a choice to be like that. It's how I write. I'm always focused on the reader and always conscious that, because so far most of my work has only ever appeared in India, I'm very conscious that the Indian reader is still wary of science fiction, unwilling to read it unless they can easily identify. So by and large, I try to keep the scale personal. But I won't pretend that I'm doing, very mechanistically and that I very carefully work it out. I don't force my writing in the sense that I like it to be organic. As soon as I get a prompt, I'll say yes. And then as soon as I have said yes, then that switch turns on. And it's like, that whatever the locator device in my brain starts to look for ideas that will feed into this particular situation.
To me, somehow, particularly in Empty Glass, which is kind of dealing with a very metaphysical situation wherein an atheist is invited to a celestial conference.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's not just an atheist, he's a loud and proud atheist.
Yes.
And he's a very, I would say, angry man. And that was a very interesting perspective for me to read, because I was thinking a lot of it is like kind of, I felt like playing on a little bit of stereotypes about this kind of hard-boiled journalist, who drinks a lot but does his work and like has been on the war front, and kind of, playing a little bit with stereotypes to the point where he's hit with something that even he can't like act like is, this is, I can be blasé about this. And I really enjoyed that. But also wanted to know why it was important to you to write what was essentially kind of a religious story, I would say, like in the sense it's from the perspective of a doubter, but it is about religion and God.
So for this, I have an unexpected answer. The unexpected answer is this story is based on a dream I had, in which I and somebody else, I'm not sure who, and it sort of didn't matter, had been invited to a conference of gods. And in the dream, I mean, when one narrates a dream, of course, one is embellishing a little bit because the dream is entirely in one's head and it's all feelings and emotions and so on. But in the dream, the sense of, how shall we say, anticipation, of excited anticipation of, it's like, now we're going to actually see God. And there are lots of other gods. There are lots of, and it's not that we could actually see anything. It was nebulous. Everything was nebulous, and but there was a stage. And this much is true to the dream, that there was a chair. And again, of course, I can't report on the extent to which my memory of the dream builds on some little fragment. But at least as far as I can report, then in the dream, there was one of those swivel chairs that you see, the very simple kind of swivel chair on stage. And I and my whatever companion, we knew from the program notes that this was the God for Earth. There was no discussion of what religion. It was God. And that entity was sitting in the chair, and it was the chair, the back of the chair was to the audience. And we were waiting like, for it to turn around. And it turned, and there was nothing to see. And it was like, like huge disappointment, but also, yeah, what else? I mean, we know that we cannot see the face of God.
And I mean, you've written some other work which is kind of focused on India of the future, which I really thought was alarmingly close to what we already have. Like, I was like, are we dystopian anymore? I mean, I think we're already in that territory,
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
One was India 2099, which made me laugh out loud.
Yeah, but that was very much written, at the time that it's like in 1999. And Vinod Mehta had sent out an invitation to a number of his regulars, and I was just one of them, to write about the next 100 years, to imagine what it would be like at 2099. And that's what I wrote. So he is the old editor who wakes up in that.
It is quite fascinating because until I finished reading the book and looked at the acknowledgements and things like that, the last section, I didn't realize when you'd written it. So I was kind of laughing at the concept of...
Yes, it seemed prophetic.
It did. And I kind of think I should be uneasy about what you're writing in 2024.
Well, I'm writing the third book in what will now be a trilogy of Escape Island, and the next one, which I have a name for it, it's called Zone. Of course, when here am I trying to say that I try to write less frightening or distancing books, but the zone is going to be really dark. I mean, oh goodness. The only light I can offer is that, I mean, it's not light, but the thing to look forward to, I would say, is that in the first two books, the main character, that is Meiji, is barely, she's not very expressive. In the first one, she's a child. In the second one, she's so insecure and also so disturbed by her situation. She really doesn't talk much. So in neither of these two books does she really have a voice. She can't have a voice. In this third book, she has a voice.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that.
It's not, I think she gets to say a lot. But one of the responses to Island, and I agree with that response, I think the person reading it, one of the people reading it, who read it very, how should we say, she looked forward to reading it and was put off and saddened, I think, to realize that the women on the island of Lost Girls, that what should have been a shelter and a refuge was so much not. She was saddened and disappointed that the women on that island were also nasty. Not that they were all nasty, but that they were nasty in the same way that people, I think that is one of the points I like to make. Women are not necessarily better than men. Women in institutions have, we know from the documentary record, are not better. And why do we pretend that we have some kind of angelic, natural angelic nature? We don't. And we have to, I find that when I say we in this context, I mean women, do not seem to maintain a clear notion of morality, which is not from outside, that is an internal morality. We have yet, in a sense, to work out a morality which is deep and which is compassionate. And I find that, I mean, as many women think of themselves as feminists, there is such an urge to denounce those who break with feminists or feminist thought that I really worry about the nature of feminist thought if it is not equally compassionate towards all those who are not necessarily within the fold, and also to those who are not women, in the sense that it's hard to be compassionate across the many genders.
Yes, and I think that's something that's become clearer as time goes on, because I see it a lot in this kind of discourse around feminism and around really compassion, because right now it feels like the world is singularly lacking in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And as you said, it is, people can't resist the urge to other.
Yes. I mean, my sister was telling me a story about young women of her, women in their late teens, 20s, I think. Anyway, and an altercation that occurred at the time of what should have been an end of term dinner. And these two girls just went after each other in a public place, in a restaurant, based on such, such mundane hostilities. It really makes you think, do we have to learn again and again? Every generation has to learn yet again that you have to let go, your fixations. So what if she doesn't eat? She eats meat and I don't. Oh my God, then you can't be at the same table. You have to tear each other apart. It's just food.
But then, I mean, as a lot of people have observed, food is very political. So I guess it's also so many layers to these kind of things.
That's where, I mean, it's easy to be compassionate amongst, it's like amongst friends, it's fine. it's much harder to be compassionate towards your enemy. And if you can't be, there is no meaning to that compassion. There's no meaning to being kind to people who are exactly like you.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to make enemies out of a lot of people, they're not going to go away. They're going to continue speaking up, and you're going to continue speaking up. And somewhere along the way, there has to be a compromise. You have to share space. So, I mean, not that that means that I'm any better at this. I don't claim to be, but
Well, none of us is. It's like in Alice in Wonderland, in Alice Through the Looking Glass, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, they're twins and they're getting along. And then they have that fit about a stupid rattle. They both, they start to vibrate with fury. And I think that is at the heart of it, it's just a rattle. We can see it's just a stupid rattle. But for them, it's the whole world. That's the end.
But speaking of non-vegetarianism, I want to come back to feast, which is actually non-vegetarianism in its purest form, I suppose.
Highest, yes, is most extreme. Right.
But I actually was very taken by both feast and the government of India undertaking. I think because you explore mortality in a very different way, because I kind of loved the idea of an immortal slowly losing themselves because of a belief system that they weren't a part of, while simultaneously eating like a glutton, like feasting like never before. But the idea that you could be consuming so much and losing yourself at the same time was really interesting. And similarly, this concept of this ridiculous government office, and I had a very clear mental picture of what that was, because it made me think of going to get my driver's license, or like, you know what I mean? Like the description of the line in particular, I was like, yep, I know it well. So what kind of prompted these, like the idea of like exploring mortality in these very like different ways, but at the same time, it is about mortality.
I went to Catholic schools, so I was fully looped into the concepts of Christianity. And then at the same time, around the same time, began to understand the competing, shall we say, religious ideas. I should step back here and mention that because of the way I grew up in different countries, I was exposed to many different religious faiths because we lived in Europe, so that was Christianity. Then we lived in Pakistan, so that was Islam. Then we came to India. Of course, that's the polyglot Indian, range of religions. Then we went to Thailand, so that was Buddhism. And then we went to Iran, that was the other kind of Islam, that was Shia. And then back in India, I was for 2.5 to 3 years immersed in the Parsi religion because of the magazine. And then much later in life, in my late mid-30s, I went to Bhutan and became aware of the other kind of Buddhism, the Mahayana school. And the result of all of this is that I really think I got a huge exposure to many ways of being, many ways of thinking about this life, the afterlife, moral and ethical behavior, and so on. So, in the way that these things mingled and came out in different ways in my mind, I would say that even though I'm not religious and I have no faith, and I do not assume any, if I'm asked to name a faith, I say I'm agnostic. I don't say atheist. Unlike my journalist, I don't call myself an atheist because I follow the idea that if you deny the existence of something, then you are confirming it by denying it. So, this is a classic argument. It's not something that I made up. But as an agnostic, you're saying you don't know. And I would say that is my situation. I don't know. Maybe there is something out there, but personally, I don't feel it. I don't have faith. And yet I'm moved by faith, very moved. So it's not at all that I have no sympathy or no interest, or it's completely blank. It's not completely blank. And when I came to understand what is referred to as reincarnation, I mean, both the Buddhist form and the Hindu form, I just don't buy it. I don't believe in reincarnation. The other day, I remember having a conversation with a young woman. She's Ladakhi. We were talking about something of consequence to her. And she said, after all, you believe in reincarnation, don't you? And I said, no, I don't. She said, what? You don't believe in reincarnation? Does that mean that you don't believe that Dalai Lama is an incarnate? And I said, I can believe that he is a wonderful human being and tremendously knowledgeable. But because I don't have faith, I'm not saying it's not true. I'm saying I can't believe. And I can be wrong. But that's all I can say. So it must be obvious that these issues go on and on. And of course, I mean, as in the government of India understanding, what is the situation with amoeba? How does it get reborn, or does it? The problem for me with reincarnation is the suggestion that it just happens, but nothing just happens. So there has to be a bureaucracy. So that it just leads down a terrible path. So it can't be. It just can't be.
I think you've articulated a lot of questions that a lot of us have, right, about this whole system. And the system differs, as, in the story, the protagonist kind of assumes, hey, I can jump the line because you're only dealing with these many people. And hey, it makes sense. I can kind of start this cool new program. And this man quickly deflates him by saying, hey, you know what? We're still worrying about the amoebas. There's a lot in line before you. I thought that was both hilarious, but also kind of telling about how we think about the world, because it's also a very Indian thing, right? We're like, hey, by the way, I know I can bribe you and I can kind of skip the line and you'll be okay with it.
Yeah, because we're always doing that all the time.
Exactly. And I mean, it's a symptom of a much larger issue, but it was amazing to see it play out in this context.
No, I had but that was also my first published story. And it was a story I worked on it. I worked on it a great deal. It did not just come out like that, No,
and I thought it was wonderful that it had been written, so long ago, because I read it and I felt it very viscerally. Especially I've mentioned this before, but the bit about the queue and the way people were breathing and kind of the idea that, you're in a perpetual wait for something. And I was like, it could have been written last year. It could have been written this year. But anyway, on that very metaphysical note, I think we'll have to kind of end the conversation because I've kept you here.
Yes, because it is almost 2:00.
Yes. I realized that I just looked at the clock and I was feeling quite ashamed of myself for running over time.
I'm a late nighter. I stay up late.
But before we sign off, I always ask, is there anything that you're working on currently? Anything that you have in the pipeline that you want to shout out so that people know what to expect?
Well, the thing I want to shout out about, it's not in the pipeline, it's out there, is the novel called Taxi that I'm very keen people know about, because it doesn't, in today's world, unless you're a super bestseller, you're nothing. There's only up there or nothing. So I'm currently in the nothing phase, and Taxi is not it's not dark, it's not science fiction, it's set in New Delhi, nothing, well, a few little weird things happen, but nothing science fictional. And it's almost funny, I would say. So I would say my shout out would be, please go out, buy it. You don't even have to read it, just buy it. Which is horrible. Okay, read it.
We can do better than that. Come on. I say go out and buy Taxi and Stolen Hours, because we have to aim high here.
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, Manjula.
We're going to pare this down to just 15 minutes of extremely intense. But it was great fun. Thank you.
For our listeners, she actually stayed up till 2 a.m. to do this, so we appreciate you even more. And thanks for being on Arcx.
Thank you for doing this. And all those out there who listen and whom you feed with your interviews, thank you for that.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. You can follow Manjula on Instagram at Manjula Padmanabhan. Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.